I think that the classical liberal idea of rights is compatible with Christianity, for example, because although Christianity makes enormous demands of us, it's really more about duties than rights. The only way in which we can really kind of be self-directed executioners of our duty, the only way we can actually go about and serve one another, is if we are, to a certain extent, left alone by the powers that be, the powers of the modern state.
So I'm very pleased to be joined by Benedikt Koehler, who in fact, he came to the IEA when I was academic research director with the idea of this book. He had written a number of different chapters. It wasn't just an ego trip, I assure you, from Benedikt, but it was, and we thought, we looked at different variations, because one of the things we want to do at the IEA is to make sure that we continue that strong academic tradition and have conversations like this where we can challenge each other, but we have civil discourse. Benedikt is a fellow in Economics Religion at the IEA. Dr. Koehler studied the impact of Abrahamic religions on medieval economics and business. He's written biographies of Adam Müller, Ludwig Bamberger, and is the author of Early Islam and the Birth of Capitalism. Just to prove it, here's a copy here. A fantastic book. He's the editor of Faith and Markets, and he authored the chapters on the economics in the book of Moses, Muhammad's concept of property, and Christian approaches to property rights. Billy Christmas is a senior lecturer in political philosophy and director of the PPE programme at King's College London in the Department of Political Economy. And his research interests are in rights, property and political authority. He teaches in subjects across political and economic philosophy, and he also sits on the IEA's Academic Advisory Council and takes a keen interest in the interaction between faith and economics, and has recently converted to Christian orthodoxy. Just to make sure that I've got through all the announcements. First of all, we are selling copies of this book tonight at the store in the reception room. And because we understand that we want to give you fine people a great deal, we've got a special offer tonight for £10 instead of the usual £17.50. So please do think about it. All the money goes to a good cause. And as another voice from above comes into my head. This panel is being filmed for the IEA's YouTube channel, and there will be a Q&A at the end, during which your question will be recorded, though the camera will remain on us. So you'll be an anonymous voice. Now, of course, if you want to show off to your friends and everything, I could ask if the camera could turn to you. But at the moment, it's much simpler. That it shows us. If you've got any issues with that, please let us know. Get someone else to ask your question. Send us a paper or something like that. I can't receive text because everything's in airplane mode. Today also is the at the end of the Q&A. We hope just to run in tonight. I will start the discussion very soon. I will start with some Q&A, and then I'll open it up to the general audience. We'll try and end the proceedings by about 7:45, and the bar will be open for another sort of 20 minutes, so we can continue discussions. You can swap business cards, and maybe you can, if you decide to convert to one of the other faiths, you can make your proclamation at the time. So, and I'm just trying to make sure I've got everything right. That's it. So why don't we make a start, and I will start with Benedikt. And just Benedikt, frankly, what inspired you, or what gave you the idea, first of all, for the book, but also you clearly have a long history in an interest in the interaction between faith and free markets and faith and liberties. Where did that fascination come from?
The fascination it came from my interest in history. That's my background. That's always been with me during my career while I was working, which was in the city and which was in Whitehall in economics. And I've always felt that economics has a long history which predates what we liberals and libertarians tend to think as something that came from the Enlightenment or after. Because the Enlightenment itself is rooted in something that happened long before and is the culmination and the continuation of something that happened long before. So I just began digging and discovered one thing after another. So one thing led to engagement with people who were involved in the history of religion, were important in that context. And it was really, I have a hard time remembering who it was who nudged me to this realization when I discovered that one of the founders of an Abrahamic religion, Muhammad, had been a merchant. And when I discovered that, I felt, well, I've written other papers on other business people in other historic eras. I bet there's a paper in there somewhere, and that's how it started. And that was about 12 or 14 years ago. And so here we are today.
Well, that's a fantastic story, and we're all very grateful that you've taken us down that road. Billy, this is a sort of, like many of us, an overlap or a sort of Venn diagram intersection between two interests. We are classical liberals, but we are also people of faith, and we don't mean that in sort of a pious way. It's just, in a society of free will, you freely choose the faith you decide to follow, and being of no religion or having no faith or being agnostic is an equally valid a choice for anyone in a free society. What is it about was there anything about your belief in classical liberalism or your classical liberalism that led you to the faith, or do you think there were two separate worlds that actually kind of combine in a discussion like this tonight?
No, I mean, I don't think that my own kind of political and economic convictions led me to my faith. But what I did find was how much my political and economic convictions were owed to the Christian religion, or perhaps Abrahamic faiths more generally. And I think that we really underestimate, probably since the early modern period of scholarship in Western Europe, we really underestimate how much these ideas, these very basic ideas that underpin all our kind of political and economic theories, how much they come from Christianity, how much they come from the church. And I think that is a basic kind of egalitarian idea, which is that all humans are equally valuable, and that all humans are equally endowed with some sort of dignity. And I think that's really the basis for classical liberalism, is that everyone's freedom matters, not just some people on the top of the hierarchy. I think it's the basis for egalitarian political philosophies, for utilitarian political philosophies, the idea that everyone's welfare counts, everyone's dignity counts. So it was more like something that I realised that this thing that I've been carrying around for such a long time was actually kind of indebted to this thing that was quite new to me.
Yeah, and it's very valuable. Now, we've got a quite a provocative statement or question. Is God a free marketeer? Of course, you have to believe in God to ask that question. But what's interesting about this is, in many ways, why do we even ask the question? And what I mean by that is not an assumption, but there will be people in all faiths who have a different tradition. So there'll be Christian socialists, there'll be Jewish socialists, there'll be Muslim socialists as well. And they will argue that their faith makes them a socialist or it makes them a Marxist. What is it about both of you, and I'll start with you, Billy, if that's okay, that there is no inherent contradiction, or why you think it's perfectly acceptable, or not acceptable, compatible to be a Christian and a classical liberal?
That's a good question.
Sorry, I should have prepared him, shouldn't I, really? Sorry.
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to say that God is a free marketeer, but I think that they're certainly compatible. I think that the general classical liberal idea, I understand it in terms of as a kind of a claim about our rights, and I think that the classical liberal idea of rights is compatible with Christianity, for example, because although Christianity makes enormous demands of us, it's really more about duties than rights. The only way in which we can really kind of be self-directed executioners of our duty, the only way we can actually go about and serve one another, is if we are, to a certain extent, left alone by the powers that be, the powers of the modern state. If we are forced to serve each other in particular ways, like in some kind of totalitarian regime that creates a community that we're forced to serve, that's not really a virtue. It's not really a self-directed form of serving one another out of love. So I think that the kind of freedom that classical liberals believe in is a necessary condition for us to kind of live out our religious obligations. Even if it's not sufficient for them, it sets up this framework in which that becomes possible.
And do you ever think about, say, the other side of the debate, where there might be Christian socialists who say, this is exactly, no, this was a left of centre think tank. They might be saying exactly the same thing. Is God a socialist, or is God a sympathetic to state redistribution, for example?
I mean, I think it's a reasonable view. I mean, I don't really think it's true, but I think it is complicated, and it's certainly a reasonable view. So I think that we are commanded to give our wealth away to those who need it, and to give our assistance to those who need it. I think that when we extinguish that duty through the state, that part of that is lost, because it's forced upon us.
And Benedikt, you've clearly written about the three Abrahamic faiths. You've written elsewhere about classical liberal ideas and history of liberalism. And in some ways, really the same question. If you are a Christian, Muslim, or Jew, is it obvious you're a classical liberal, or the other way around? Or there's no inherent contradiction between having classical liberal views and being religious.
My view about religion and economics is that economics comes out of religion. If you look back, I mentioned earlier that our intellectual traditions have very deep roots. And at the time when these traditions were very young and were planted, our entire life was permeated by approaches to religion. And modern sociology, Durkheim in particular, would have pointed out it's from religion that all of our notions of how we interact with each other come from. And it's not true not only of economics, it's also true of our approaches to rule, of state, even of warfare. All of those, when we began thinking about these issues as in the dawn of human history, all of these were filtered by what we thought about religion. We did not distinguish between, on the one hand, the life of religion, and on the other hand, other segments of our social lives. Religion permeated all aspects of social lives. So therefore, the further you think about notions such as market, the further you think about market being exercise of free choice, if you think about liberty of choice, you will sooner or later ask yourself, well, where does liberty come from? And if you look furthest enough, deepest enough, you will say those initial issues over what constitutes liberty were assessed by and were thought about by people in religion.
Now, that all sounds wonderful to someone like me who's a classical liberal and professes to have a faith. And it's nice and convenient that those two intersect. But can you also see the argument on the other side of the political spectrum from Jewish socialists, Jewish Christians, Jewish Muslims, etc. Not Jewish Muslims, that'd be wonderful, wouldn't it? Muslim socialists, for example, Muslim Marxists, that they can also say the same thing about that intersection between their faith and their political ideology.
Yeah, see, I agree entirely that somebody could come to that conclusion. And the reason I feel that way, or say that, and feel confident in making that assertion, is that there is a difference between, let's pick one of these three religions, the same would apply to the other two. There's a difference between the history of Christianity, the history of Christendom, the history of Christian churches, and indeed the history of Christians too. Those are three different histories. And once religion turns into an institution, there is an interference, if that's the right word, between the religious intent, the thrust, the content, the core, and the interests and the activities of an institution. And I can well understand that somebody who has a particular attitude to Christianity can say, yes, but my reading, my path through the histories of Christianity, Christendom, and Christian church leads me to being a radical socialist. I can see why that would happen.
Yeah, I think one of the arguments by those on the left who see, who are of a faith, but also on the left of British politics, it always boils down to the role of the state, doesn't it, in many ways? All faiths say that we should look after the poor. All faiths say that there should be some sort of redistribution. Doesn't characterise how. All faiths talk about some notion of social justice. I mean, probably the Catholic social teaching more than any other specifically uses the phrase social justice, and therefore the debate could be, should that be private charity or should that be the state that redistributes? Would you agree with that? What I've just said there, Billy?
I think that's right. Yeah, definitely.
And that happened, and look at the big, I think the big split happened here. See, I may be jumping ahead, and I hope I'm not taking the wind out of the sails of someone else. This happened during the Reformation. The medieval world was one where religion dominated all aspects of life. Then when people felt, well, we want to split not from Christianity, but from the institution which has a monopoly on that religion, they had new approaches. For example, to social welfare. And if you look at parts of Europe, such as Scandinavia, which is famous for its long tradition and its adherence and its incentive to promote social welfare and social states, if you look at when that tradition began, it goes back much further than the Great Depression or even the 19th century. It goes back to Mr. Martin Luther. And when in Scandinavian countries, unlike this country, Protestantism was promoted through Lutheranism, a Lutheran household contained the requirement to look after its neighbors, and a Lutheran king who was tasked with looking after Lutheran households would encourage them to look after other households in need. So the social welfare state of Scandinavia could be written, could be drafted, and would probably in very few respects be amended by Dr. Martin Luther. So this is where you have the split between religions and institutions.
And I was going to ask you, and come back to you on this, Benedikt, which is, you obviously put together the chapters in the book, or read some of the chapters of the book. You also have written about the 3 different Abrahamic faiths. So far, anyone listening to us would think, well, they're all the same, or they all believe there's a compatibility between liberty, freedom, and the faiths. But what I'd like to do is really investigate, are there some differences, and notable differences, that you think should be highlighted or you wish to highlight now?
Well, that's a very challenging question. As yet, allow me just a detour for one moment, because you spoke about the Abrahamic religions as that trinity or that unity and being different. Where the Abrahamic faiths are the real challenge they are to us in Europe and in Western civilization is that our Western civilization did not bring forth our own religions. We had them, the ancient Greeks did, the ancient Romans did, but Zeus and Jupiter and Athena and Minerva, they've all evaporated. They evaporated after the import of spirituality, which came from Jerusalem and from Mecca. And 2,000 years, for a good long time now, Europeans could have evolved and unfolded religions of their own. We have not succeeded in doing that. We have succeeded in establishing models of rationality, and those still go, I'm always talking about the roots of something, they still, you can track them back to Athens and to Rome. But we do not have indigenous religions. Yes. So here we are. This is where the great challenge lies for us in the West, that there is this, I wouldn't call it a void. There are many people who say, well, thank God we don't have religions. But I would say that where we do have religions, they're not homegrown. And religions are as distant to us here, who are indigenous to Europe, as we sometimes allege Western rationality is to places outside of Europe. Mm-hmm. So I still haven't answered your question. Fine. So where are the differences between the 3? My interest, as you know, I'm not a theologian. But study of religion and study of theology are adjacent but different fields. My interest is in economics. Yes. And my interest in the history of economics in modest ways contributes to demonstrating that in economic practices, the 3 Abrahamic religions have a great deal in common, and what they have in common as common denominator is over time, with glacial speed, but over time they do learn from each other.
It's interesting what you say about the faiths coming from the East in many ways, for a sort of generalisation without being too Orientalist about it. It reminds me of a conversation I had a few weeks ago with someone, and I wasn't sure whether they were serious or telling a joke. But they said about an American tourist who went to Israel, Palestine, and saw some Christians there. He said, "Geez, I didn't know we had Christians here." I said, "Who converted you?" They said, "Jesus." Billy, you've read some of the chapters in the book, and and given where you're coming from with your own faith and your belief in classical liberalism and your interest in philosophy, has the book prompted you to think about not only where the faiths agree, but also where there might be some deviations, or that's too strong a word, differences?
I mean, the thing that I found really fascinating is in chapter 5 of the book, which I think you wrote. Yeah, that's yours, right? Yeah. On
I can check that.
The way in which property rights were kind of just revolutionized with the advent of Christianity. In particular, the idea of giving. So, I mean, Benedikt's thesis is all about the idea of the foundational to property rights, really thinking about them morally, is actually the entitlements of the poor to arms, and that everything else came out of there. And it's a completely different way of thinking about property rights that probably classical liberals are typically think of, right? Which is like, okay, so the idea that the rights of the poor or something that goes against the idea of private property, because that gives someone some right to interfere in your private property. Yeah. And Benedikt's thesis is there was no other way of conceptualizing that the poor were entitled to a decent standard of living, or to a minimal standard of living, without saying that, they have an entitlement to possess some resources, and that is a property right. And it changed the entire, I don't want to put words in my mouth, but the way I understood it was that it changed the entire teleology of what it meant to give to others, which is that in the ancient world, to give to others was all about inflating your own status, donating to a temple or whatever. So it was kind of like, you could say it's a kind of supply side. I give because I want to, it's about me, it's about the supply side.
It's a transaction as well.
Yeah. Whereas the Christian idea of giving was demand side. It was because you're entitled to this and I'm not. Yeah. So here, take it. And I found that quite amazing, actually.
I'm currently doing some research and putting together a book on social justice from different faith perspectives, and very strong in Catholic social teaching. The whole idea from sort of Taparelli and others who came up with this idea. And what's interesting about it, it does talk about the dignity of man as well. Doesn't necessarily mean the equality of outcomes, but it also means dignity also means paying a worker sufficient money for him or her to look after their family, and that's dignity. Really interesting, because that might challenge the sort of notion of some people on the right will say there should be no minimum wage. The challenge of that is actually you can pay people below the minimum wage, but the state then still tops it up, as it were. So there's some real challenges here, I think, for all of us, and particularly when it's not just neat and simple, as you say, with property rights, for example. There's another concept which is not inherently contradictory, but it's another dimension to consider. Sorry, do you want to come in here, Benedikt?
Oh no, you've probably heard me say this before, especially in approaches to charity. There's a clear unfolding and evolution if you follow Moses, Jesus, and Mohammed, and because Moses there are many prescriptions to help the poor in the Old Testament, for example, the practice of gleaning, so that the poor people could harvest whatever was left over by a farmer once he'd done his harvest. But it was help to self-help.
Yes.
And I know this is a simplification, so there's no need for somebody to point this out. And the second simplification is that Jesus encouraged giving alms, and as St. Paul would write, God loves a cheerful giver. So you don't really... It's good if you do that, and you'll get a pat on the back for it. And then comes Mohammed, and his idea is zakat. And in what initially, when he started his life, as his career progressed, things changed. But when he started, he introduced zakat, which was an annual gift. That was voluntary. That too was voluntary, became prescriptive. But if you look from Moses to Jesus to Mohammed, it's help to self-help. It's help when it works out, when you can, and with Mohammed, it becomes systematic and becomes a thing that you need to do for year after year. So there's an evolution in stages, which, if I can just elaborate on that too, it might have something to do with their respective social backgrounds, because Moses was from an aristocratic background, Jesus was a working class background, and Mohammed was middle class. He came from a commercial environment, and that might have had something to do with it. But I'm sure there will be some who might see it differently.
I'm interested in this when we look at charity, because all faiths agree that I don't think there's any faith that doesn't say or says don't give to the poor, don't help the poor. But none are neutral. They all suggest that we should look after our fellow man or in the modern world humankind, our brothers and sisters. But the debate between us and the left, if you like, is the role of the state. And it's interesting, do either of you think, having looked at this from a religious perspective, that, given that there has to be some state, or have you thought about the concept of how large a state is? I'm not saying that, you were a anarcho-capitalist, and then when you suddenly became a Christian, that's unfair, not suddenly, but when you became more observant, you thought, actually, I now see more of a role for the state. Has your faith altered the way you look at the state?
Not really,
okay.
Actually.
Fair enough.
No, not the state in
I'm
particular.
clearly struggling for questions here, aren't I?
It's,
Yeah.
no, actually it hasn't, strangely enough.
Yeah.
I mean, something which I could answer in a bit more depth. You said about Catholic social teaching and the idea of paying someone a kind of a living wage. And I think with so many of these things, especially if you go back and if you look at the church fathers and the kind of things that they say about property ownership and stuff, I think that you have to update it to your particular context, because they're talking about a particular economic reality at the time. And in the ancient period and to a significant extent in the medieval period, wealth was basically, if you had lots of land and you had good weather, you were rich. If you had little land or bad weather, you were poor. If you had no land, you were poor or a slave or a serf. And I think in that context where property is pretty much zero sum, right? For you to have lots means someone else doesn't have any. And I think that now we have sophisticated market institutions. That isn't the case anymore. And so when you have that kind of zero sum state of affairs, it's obvious if you have some duty to give wealth away, you should just give it all away, right? All of it, as long as you have enough to survive. But to be able to give away the most, you need to be a good custodian of wealth. And in the modern world, the best way to have a lot of wealth to give away is not just to give it all away, it's to invest it, it's to safeguard it, and to be a good custodian of it. And that might mean you own like absolutely loads, but it means you have more to give away if you're a good custodian of the wealth.
But you've got to remember to keep it away at some stage as well, haven't you?
Yeah, at some point.
Yeah. It's interesting because there was a article from someone in the FT fund management part, and she was writing that she was very annoyed with financial advisors. I mean, some people are very annoyed with financial advisors, but she was for a particular reason. So because basically all it does is it encourages you to grow more and more wealth. It doesn't say to you at some stage of life, start reducing your wealth. You build more and more wealth, and in fact, in many cases, you just leave it for another generation. And sometimes that may do a disservice to the next generation because they get everything too easily. And you should spend your money in your lifetime. And she wasn't particularly religious, I don't think, but she was saying, what's the point of having all this wealth just to leave it when you die? Sorry, but a similar question to what I asked.
Same question. I feel more comfortable talking about the evolution of religions, which is a complicated topic, but less complicated than talking about the evolution of the state. I have great problems and issues with the notion of the state. We take it for granted that there are states. And my view is, I'll put my cards on the table, the state happened post-French Revolution, it's post-Enlightenment. Until then, there were no states. So I'm trying to make clear in my mind, I was just thinking as Billy was just speaking, well, what was the first state? And I was thinking back, well, when do I think there was the first state, for example, the state of Israel? When did it actually happen? There is that moment. I do have the solution to this question. I've solved the puzzle. When the Israelites left Egypt, there was that moment when they were through the desert and Moses decided everybody should pay a share for the priests. And I said, well, here's somebody asking for what looks like a tax. So as far as I'm concerned, the state of Israel was created when the Israelites were on the move out of ancient Egypt. Yeah. But the state as a notion of something that's separate from us, an institution that you can sue because it's the state, because it has its own armed forces, its own hospital. All of that is very modern. Yeah, and I think I would be backed up with this if you look at Roman history and told Julius Caesar or Augustus, well, you head up the state, he would have said, the what?
Yeah. I mean, I teach international relations, and so one of the things we do look at is the state. And if you look at the notion of state, it's very much a Westphalian European notion of post-war, stopping future wars, deciding that you've got to stand in army, all that. What's really interesting when I teach international relations for the states is so many parts of the world, like the Middle East, Africa, even Latin America to a certain extent, were artificial creations by colonialists. And sometimes people think, even to this day, that they are still suffering as a result of that. Others say, get over it was over 100 years ago. But it's really, and not all these states are ethnocentric. And there have been people who have complained, even to this day, that some of the problems are due to the artificial carving up. The issue now is, where we don't start from a state of nature, we start from where we are now. How do you get to a so-called better arrangement or better ethnocentric states, if you want to go that far. Look, I think I've spoken enough, certainly. So I think we should open up to the floor, if that's possible. Could you put your hand up? We'll pass the mic to you. What we'll do is and then please tell us who you are. There's no compulsion here either, by the way. Just as there's no compulsion in faith, there's no compulsion to reveal who you are. But we would like to know, just understand your question. So let's do the lady at the back there, and then we'll do the three gentlemen in the second row. Please. Yes, please, reveal yourself as it were.
I really appreciate a lot of what you're saying. I think my big question is, because I do believe your point.
Sorry, just checking with the microphone's on. Is it on? Can you hear?
I fully hear the point about this being Abrahamic religions having this key point about charity, where I wonder, whether or not the modern state is necessary. Has the horse not bolted in terms of how much charity is available in this day and age? Because at least here in Western Europe and in North America, unfortunately, we're largely a God-free society, at least compared to what's said for the past 1,500 years. So what would you all say is a solution for the lack of Abrahamic religion in society that encourages charity?
Okay. Thank you. Which one would you like to start?
Well, this is just impromptu. It is because you're saying the horse has bolted. I like that. I like that image. But supposing we wouldn't have a state, or just to roll back in time to the years before there was the social welfare state, people looked to their congregations and for provision of charity. Now, it was in the times of mass migration into cities, when the small units or parish units, where subsidiarity was possible because everybody knew everybody else, because everybody saw each other at least once on Sunday when they went to church. When that system dissolved, when that society dissolved, because people moved into the slums of wherever and didn't know each other, then all of a sudden mass poverty became a huge issue. Until that time, there was no such thing as mass poverty. There were many poor to be sure, but you were looked after by somebody who was you were in line of sight of others who would help you. Now the poor are no longer in line of sight. We've outsourced the issue, and that happens through the modern society and through the modern state.
Yeah, I think on the one hand, like modern economic growth combined with the welfare state is this extraordinarily good thing that's happened, that not only the average standard of living, but like the bottom standard of living is now so high that this is like a good thing, which surely is like pleasing to God, regardless of what else you might believe about him. But on the other hand, there is this terrible danger, which is that the idea that everyone is looked after by this impersonal force, the state. It just gives us permission to just look past each other. If you walk through the street and you see someone in need, and you're just like, well, I paid 45% of my income in tax this year. Like, sorry, go to whatever go get some welfare from the state. That isn't, although it's probably a good thing that we have very good welfare states. That isn't what we're like called to do as believers. Is to just like pay our compulsory contribution. We're called to actually look each other in the eye and help one another, and have that communion together. And I think the welfare state, you use the phrase outsourcing, it makes it completely vicarious, and also just gives us some kind of reason to say, no, I've already done my bit, when really we haven't.
Yeah, just the welfare state. Just one of the things that I found so interesting when welfare legislation was passed in Germany in the 1880s. And there are many interpretations why this was done, but let's give people the benefit of the doubt and say it was in good faith. It was regarded by the government as being practical Christianity. And the objections in Parliament against it came from two sources, from two factions in Parliament that usually didn't have much in common. One was the liberals, because they thought people should look after themselves, and the other were the Catholics. And the Catholics felt the practical Christianity in the hands of the state will actually dissolve the notion of charity and will be counterproductive.
I'll just add, I've been doing a lot of thinking about this and about the state, and the interns, only yesterday I gave them a talk on welfare beyond the state and talked about the history of the welfare state in the UK. We've had a system even as early as Elizabethan times, the late 16th century, the first poor laws were in this country and they've become adapted over time. We saw an acceleration of that at the beginning of the last century. What was interesting was before that we had lots of friendly societies. And mutuals and trade unions that did much of the stuff that the state does now. Now, initially, when the pensions came through, or state pensions were announced in 1910, 1911, that was because even the friendly societies welcomed that because they said, we don't provide that. We're very happy to. So there was a moment when even the friendly societies and charities and others were saying, there are gaps, let's have the state fill those gaps. The problem is, as anyone who read the Beveridge report and then the subsequent response by the government at the time, was we moved to a situation where the state has squeezed out many of those friendly societies and much of that provision. It'd be very difficult, because we're not in a state of nature, to go back to that, and also there are higher expectations as our society has got wealthier about what we can all do. The real debate now is about private charity in the state, and there are writers on the left who say, the poor don't want your charity. No, who are you to give them charity? And also, it's not fair for them to rely. We need a good, strong state. But there are others who say, well, if you look at it, demand is outstripping supply. And therefore, we are going to have to start working with encouraging more and more civil society. You think about the fact we've got a state health system in this country. We've got more doctors and nurses than ever before. This is not a party political broadcast, by the way. And I was a health minister for about a year. But the problem is demand is outstripping supply. People are living longer, but they are living physically longer, but not mentally longer, as it were. And therefore, there is going to have to be an emergence again, a rediscovery of civil society. And we found that partly during COVID. So I don't think it's either or. I think it's always shifting that balance between the mixed economy when it comes to helping those. But the real problem is even the church, and we have bishops in the House of Lords, they ask the state to do things that you would expect the church to do. And that is really interesting. The church now thinks the state should do stuff, even though it's got a massive property portfolio and has massive investments. It thinks that the state should do that stuff. Let's come to the three gentlemen here. Let's start with Mark, and then we'll move on. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Mark Pennington. I'm one of Billy's colleagues. So I'm an agnostic. I should say that to start off with. My question is about, I guess, paternalism. So there's quite a few comments being made about duties to help the poor. And it seems to me, I don't like the term the poor because it applies as an amorphous mass of people who are in some kind of indistinguishable class. But assume for the sake of argument that this class exists. There are two kind of, it seems to me, worst case scenarios for that group. One of the worst case scenarios is that people basically say you are deserving of your fate. That if you're poor, it's because it's your fault. Entirely. That seems to be kind of one negative possibility. But the other negative possibility is to say it's society's fault that you are poor, that you basically have no agency, and I'm going to give you this agency by giving you stuff. And what I'd like to know is a bit more from your perspectives about how faith avoids the second of those. It seems clear that it avoids the first because it's saying there's some kind of duty to help the poor. But it doesn't seem, I've not heard anything that says anything about how you avoid this projection of seeing the poor as helpless actors who cannot help themselves. And one of the things that disturbs me enormously I used to go to church when I was a sort of teenager. One of the things that drove me away from it is hearing people like the Archbishop of Canterbury speaking in this way, where it's a kind of projection from these people about what they think is a good thing to do, without any notion of what this does to the agency of those who are supposed to be helped. So I wonder if you could say something about that.
Thank you. Would either what you?
Well, but Mark, are we not? I think earlier I might not be able to exhaust all of the dimensions what you're raising and touching on. But I mentioned earlier there's a difference between the history of Christianity and the history of Christian institutions. And what you are referring to is the history of Christian institutions and the projection of a corporate message. In fact, one could say, how can a Christian church be an institution? And there are many Christian denominations, just to think of one, Baptists, who are deliberately small. They don't want to be this, like Roman Catholics have this big thing, big building where, so this is where I'm at. This is my answer to you. What you're conflating here is the corporate statements made by representatives of an institution, and what you're not ignoring, but what you're passing over or sidelining is the statements that come out of a particular set of scripture.
Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, sure. No, I think I completely agree with you about this, like this idea that the people that are deserving of our help are like a demographic class, and like I think that that's definitely not the case. I don't think it's just like, okay, well, let's identify all the people that have like the bottom income, and those are all the people that we like have a duty to assist. I mean, I don't think that's true at all. I mean, the world is now very rich. I think the people whose lives are really bad in the world at the moment is typically not just like they need an extra 5k in their bank account each year. I think, you know, the poor. I mean, we take this language from like historical writings and from scripture and stuff, because in the ancient world there was a huge amount of people who were like, you know, destitute, starving in the streets.
Agrarian society as well.
And they were a class, you know, there were a number of classes that made up the poor, you know. So, I mean, we should kind of use that, we should really use that term in scare quotes, I think. And I think the people that we have a duty to help is anyone who needs your help, you know. And in that sense, like, everyone is poor in like some way. It may be that they just need some money, it may be that they need someone to speak to or whatever. And we have a duty to help them. I mean, I think that, I mean, this is just my personal belief. I mean, I think that the point is to help them to live the kind of life that, like, God has ordained them to live.
As a Catholic would say, with dignity.
With dignity, yeah. I mean, everyone has a dignity, and that the point of helping them is to help them back to that. Of course, some people are going to be dependent on others for whatever reason, but the whole point of helping them is to live a flourishing life, the life that God really wanted them to live, and we need to, you know, be an instrument of God's will in helping them back to that. Yeah.
I mean, if I answer, I'm very struck not by religious texts but by Banerjee and Duflo, the Nobel Prize winners, who talk about the characterization of the poor. You know, people either see them as enterprising or lazy, you know, and or as cartoon characters in many ways. And Banerjee and Duflo do warn you about over-characterizing the poor. They all have different circumstances. Just because people in poor communities have a festival once a year and spend all their money on it doesn't mean that they are being frivolous or being irresponsible. You've got to understand their context and not just assume, well, they're poor, they shouldn't be doing this stuff, they should be doing something else. And I think that's really interesting. I don't think there's any inherent contradiction with faith, but nor does faith say you should. I think different people react. So there will be some people religious who do stereotype the poor, and there'll be others who say no. There's a much bigger depth there. Now I've got two people here who want to ask questions. Anyone on this side, please put your hand up, and I will come to you. We'll go one. Let's do them in twos to start off with, because you're together. I know you didn't come together. I mean, but you know, you may.
Is this on?
Yes.
Yes. So I'm Felix. I used to work here, where I currently work. I was going to ask, can a follower, my background is mostly with regards to Christianity, give a kind of wholehearted yes to capitalism and free market economics, given that a lot of these Abrahamic faiths, at the very least, seem a little bit naive about certain aspects of economics? So things like prohibiting lending and interest, things like rules about kind of cancelling debts and exactly when you do that. How do you square that circle? Do you just have to say, well, that was all pre-modern?
Please do move on. One, it makes it quicker to ask questions and answer. Two, it allows you to avoid the questions you don't want to answer. So, let's do it in twos. So you ask the question.
I must warn you that this question will be very, very different.
Yeah.
My name is Bartek, and I'm a researcher for Bright Blue, the liberal conservative think tank. But I've done 4 years of philosophy and theology, And this is a question primarily for Billy, but maybe Benedikt will have something interesting to say about it as well. So Billy, you mentioned that freedom is important because it creates the conditions for moral agents to be able to act in a virtuous way. And this is something that I happen to agree with, and it's very, very kind of nice for me to hear an expert say this as well. But isn't this an argument for maximizing agency rather than freedom? Isn't this doesn't this make freedom important in a positive sense rather than a negative one? That what is important is how much we are able to do rather than how much we are not constrained from other things. So, for example, on this kind of view, the states should, for example, provide everybody with a car, because if I had a car, then I will be able to do some really morally good things, like go to a really poor country and help people out there, which I'm not able to do now because I can't get there. But I could also do some really morally bad things, like run somebody over. So it gives me this great degree of moral choice, which enables me to make choices in terms of my moral life. Yes, so don't you think that this creates those, actually it argues for quite an interventionist state?
One each.
I'll take the first one.
You take the first one, Benedikt, and then...
Thank you. Well, I'll just take the first one.
Yeah, definitely.
Talk about usury.
Yeah.
So the first question, if I understood it correctly, is about how do you feel if you say you have respect for Abrahamic religions and we have free markets and people lend money. Haven't you got a problem with that, given that neither Moses nor Jesus nor Muhammad would have been happy with that? So let's just restrict it to this issue of lending at interest and capitalism. I'm very comfortable with capitalism, but I do not, and I have to emphasize, this is my personal view, and there will be many who say that's a minority view and untenable. I do not think that capitalism and lending at interest are joined at the hip. I do not think that you can only be a capitalist if you charge fixed interest or floating interest. I think that capitalism is also feasible if all of your investments are at your own risk, along with that of the investee. So the notion, one sometimes hears, and I'm not putting words in your mouth, but sometimes one hears the view that usury, aka lending at interest, aka capitalism, I don't think either of those two steps actually work. I do not think that usury is equal to or coterminous with lending at interest. I think usury may exist in other activities as well. And I think that the issue, the assumption that lending at interest is synonymous with usury confuses two questions, which is, the question is, what does usury consist of, and what does usury consist in? And it's very difficult when you challenge someone, say, well, what exactly is it about lending at interest that's usurious? Often there is no further follow-up. But I do think there is such a thing as usury, and I have a term for it, I call it short-changing, which can exist in any number of transactions.
Before we go to Billy, there is a debate among Muslim theologians at the moment, and I'm sure it's not only in Islam, in other countries, about what it is about usury. Is it actually against lending at interest, or is it lending at exploitative rates? And there's a whole debate about the word riba and whether it had the thing about the Quran. It was when people first wrote it down, it didn't have all the vowels to it. So some of those words could be slightly different. And it makes it, you could say, well, it's almost an a la carte faith. But the interesting thing there is that people do argue about what riba, the phrase that's used in Islam, is that interest per se, or is it exploitative? The other side to it is sometimes you will get Muslims who say, why do you take out a mortgage for your house? I said, well, I couldn't go anywhere else, Or I borrowed money from a cousin and I'm going to pay them back. Now, some Islamic banks have found another way of doing this. What they do is that there's a house on the market for £250,000. They will buy the house for £300,000 and you pay them back £300,000, claiming that's not interest, if you like. So it's really an interesting subject that people have a huge debate about. I just think people have to be, there's a pragmatism about faith and as well, and each individual will come with that balance of the pragmatism and following the faith and what the intentions are.
Sorry, I will just say something else about the debt thing as well. I think that, my understanding of it is that the ancient world in which at least the Old Testament and the New Testament are written, debt was predominantly a tool to enslave people, because debts interest would be so high that people wouldn't be able to pay it off, and then their children would be enslaved. And so forgiving debts was very much bound up with manumission. So I think it's important to always note the connection between debt and slavery, because they didn't have chattel slavery in the ancient world. It was always this sort of what's the word for it?
Indentured?
Indentured servitude, yeah. So I mean that's the way that I personally understand it.
And by the way, indentured labour wasn't only in the ancient world.
No.
I mean, the British took lots of people from India. My ancestors,
It's also
from the Indian subcontinent to the West Indies, and that was indentured labour.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, though, some of the indentured labourers were able to buy their estate eventually, so it was a very interesting thing. Anyway, do you want to answer the other question as well?
Okay. So on the very philosophical question about doesn't this mean if the whole point of freedom is to give us the necessary conditions to exercise moral agency, then isn't there a good role for the government to maximise agency? Okay, so I don't think that that's. We don't know what agency gets its value from being self-directed, in my view. So if you have a moral obligation that is placed on you by God, you can only really extinguish that if you do it of your own free will, of your own volition. I think the conditions of acting on your own volition are just not being coerced. I don't think an absence of a particular resource or tool, like a car or whatever, can mean that you're not free. Does that answer your question?
I mean, it does in a way, but there's a very obvious follow-up question.
Why don't you have a conversation afterwards?
Yeah, let's chat later.
I don't mean
everybody else is massively bored.
I would love to have this chat, but not everyone else.
I think have a conversation, and we could turn it into an IEA publication. But also maybe I don't mean it's too aggressive. Why don't the two of you go outside and sort this out like two theologians?
Yeah.
And there's some people on this side. So why don't we start off with Harris? That's right, Harris. Yeah. And then Mark, and then Dan. That's okay. And we've got about 20 minutes, so we'll try and get through the three questions. Why don't we have the three questions? Can you make notes? Have you got a good memory?
We'll listen to the yes.
Yeah. Three questions, and then we'll go to them to answer, and I may chip in as well. So please.
So certainly, as far as I'm aware, in Christianity and
sorry, introduce yourself.
Sorry, I'm Harrison. I work here at the IEA. Certainly, as far as I'm aware, in Christianity and Islam, and quite possibly in Judaism, there are anarchist traditions for various reasons, whether it's about egalitarianism, idolatry. Simple question: what does God think about political authority?
Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, Mark Glendenning. I work here as well. I was fascinated to hear about the collectivistic nature of Lutheranism, and I was wondering if you could tell me why you think there was this distinction within the Protestant world between that collectivistic statist tradition and our perception in Britain, particularly actually really in reality about Scotland, in relation to a more individualistic and entrepreneurial understanding of Protestant faith.
Mm-hmm. And just to have a hat trick of IEA employees, Dan. I just want to show everyone, not everyone here works for the IEA.
Yes, but I do. I also work here. So in the late 19th century, General Booth, the founder of the Salvation Army, said that his organisation offered people soup, soap, and salvation in the form of Christianity. Since then, we have seen across Europe the rise of welfare states, and also a dramatic decline of religious observance.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Is this a case of simply correlation, or is there an element of causation in this as well? That people were now they had a different source of soup and soap, and so they feel they don't really need the salvation anymore.
I'll just mention on the Lutheran, these questions overlap in some ways, but I think the Lutherans are a peg to hang a hat on. The reason I mentioned the Lutherans and the difference between Lutherans and other countries, Mark, is this. One often reads about the social welfare state in in Scandinavia and how it's really part of their national identity. It's something they're very proud of. And one reads far less about the exploitation of the welfare state in Scandinavia than one does in others. To take the opposite extreme of individualism, the term of the USA, which is also has many multiple religious traditions. It's where the USA is a country where the term welfare queen was coined by people who were themselves very religious, very devout politicians. You wouldn't hear that from Scandinavia, says he grandly, not knowing the place very well. But you never hear that about Scandinavia. The Scandinavians have an entirely different discourse about the nature of the welfare state. And the point I was projecting, Mark, is this, is that and that is why the study of the economics of religion is so important, because the way a culture is shaped takes place over many generations, probably, in my view, over centuries. And in the 1500s already, there was something that's recognizable as a Scandinavian welfare state taking shape in the monarchies where the king was a devout follower of the teachings of Martin Luther. And I find it very significant, very telling, something worth observing, that in those kingdoms where Martin Luther was the faith of the king, and the king, we already mentioned there were no states then already, where the king was a Lutheran, that in those states, 500 years later, you won't hear the terms used in description of the state that was created by Lutheranism that you hear in other states which are distinctly Protestant. So that shows to me just how deep the roots of religion are in the way we think about social institutions.
Just before you go on, there is another example or a thought about Scandinavians and the welfare state there. Very large welfare state, people pay relatively more taxes, but more personal freedoms, people often say. But the other issue is that worked when it was more almost, and I hope I got the right term here, mono-ethnic state, or very similar state. What's interesting, you've seen the rise of some of these populist parties as a result of saying, well, they were quite happy for people to receive welfare and have a large welfare state. But when they saw immigrants come, and don't forget, most immigrants do come to work, but clearly there will be some immigrants who do take benefits. There was certainly this feeling of the solidarity started breaking down. And they think, why are these people coming, taking our welfare? And you see that rise of anti-immigrant parties or immigrant skeptic parties. And partly because it's no longer mono-ethnic, so it's fine when we're all the same ethnicity or very similar, but now we've got more skepticism in the welfare state because there are the others who come here and take some of that. I mean, let's go back to the answers, Billy, to some of the questions.
Yeah. So the question about political authority was you. Yeah. It's yes. I mean, I think in the Old Testament you see God clearly blessing monarchy, and the way that Constantine was anointed when he established Christianity as the state religion of the empire, his anointing was patterned after the anointing of the king in the Old Testament, and that continued throughout Byzantium, and the way that the Pope was up until the 70s also crowned in a kind of monarchical coronation. And the idea is that the king is essentially blessed to be the one to enforce justice. That's it, justice, just to wield the sword to enforce justice. So there is that the head of state has a moral permission to enforce justice. Everyone else has a duty to obey them. St. Paul makes this very clear in, I think it must be Romans. He says, like, you just have to obey the ruler. And he talks about Caesar, and he said, even at the time, Caesar was a pagan ruler, and he said, he's the ruler. You should obey him. And the way that this is often misapplied in certain modern debates, which we won't go into, is that he can therefore kind of do what he wants, right? But no, he only has the permission to enforce justice, and he will be judged by the way in which he does that, right? So God gives him this power and this permission to do it, but he will be judged by how he uses it, he or she. And so there are much higher requirements of the ruler than there are of the rest of us. Now, does this mean that like only monarchy is Christian? I don't think it does, because the king is obviously the ruler, the king, the queen, the monarch is free to divide up their tasks. They're free to delegate. to the point where you have a constitutional monarchy, which is indistinguishable from a liberal democracy. So I think people often get caught up and they be like, oh no, we must, therefore the only kind of godly government must be monarchy then. I don't think that's the case. But I think that rulership, political rulership, is blessed by God, but God's places special obligations on rulers not to misuse their power, and they'll be judged by how they use what they're given. I mean, we just saw, and Said was part of the coronation that we just saw. And that is the coronation that our king has is patterned after the coronation of Constantine as well.
Even the oil came from Jerusalem. And it was very interesting. You saw that tension between Lambeth Palace and Buckingham Palace. Buckingham Palace wanted a much more modern coronation, a shorter coronation. 2 hours compared to what it was, 53. Wanted a less people, 2,000 compared to 8,000. But some people said, wow, that Archbishop of Canterbury, he really banged the Christian message, didn't he? Well, yes, it's for him, it's. If I hadn't been an Anglican, I'd have been incredibly proud that you had someone banging that message of Anglican Christianity, because he just wanted to remind the people this is not just a secular, even though in practice we might be a secular country, Christianity is a state religion, and they believe that there was some sort of religious part to the coronation. Do you want to come in?
Thank you. Well, the question was specifically about Abrahamic religions and their attitude to the state. Allow me to say that the shoe is on the other foot. The state is involved or it has a religious dimension regardless of whatever religion it adheres to. The United States is a country founded on the separation of state and religion, and every 4 years a president accedes to office in a ceremony called the inauguration. Now, the term inauguration goes back to the model of the American Republic, goes back to the Roman Republic, where a political office, a very high office, that of a consul, would not take effect until the augurs had given their blessing, and the augurs were bird watchers, who in some way would divine from the flight of birds the direction of travel or the future. So even in a profoundly secular environment, the notion that there's a religious dimension to rule persists in the very terms that we use about it.
Just want to check we've covered all three questions. Have we avoided any questions here? Dan?
Well, the welfare law kind of haven't touched on it.
Yeah, Daniel, but and Charles Booth, and it's wonderful to hear somebody mention Booth and his contemporaries. This was a terrific development, especially in this country. I think, although I'm somewhat hesitant to bring out progressive thought in Britain, because this is a country which takes great pride in advertising progress emanating from this country. But one of the great things in the second half of the 1800s was in the development of sociology and social thinking. And that spreads far across and was a role model for many other places. Before I mention Charles Booth, the first Catholic social encyclicals were drafted by Cardinal Manning, who lived not very far from here. Then Charles Booth was one of the first people to go into slums and actually look at how people live, and looked at the statistics, had the poverty maps, and would distinguish between different kinds of poverty. I think there were 7 different kinds of poverty that he would analyze. It was a very sophisticated approach to poverty and to how to approach and what to do about it. Yes, to us now it looks very paternalistic, and the business, you were mentioning 3 things, and
soup, soap, and salvation.
Yeah, soup, soap, and salvation, and I guess Victorians also had a great gift for advertising and for sound bites. But it to us now it sounds it sounds very Victorian and paternalistic. But at the time that was cutting edge.
We'll come back later.
Oh yeah, I suppose my question really was. Is there a connection between the rise of the welfare state and the decline in Christian and religious observance more generally? Because we seem to see that in European countries that, in the latter half of the 20th century you get the emergence of the welfare state, and church attendance declines dramatically, whereas in the United States you don't have quite the same process.
Yes.
Is there a link between the two, or is this just a case of correlation not equal in causation?
But I wouldn't be able to prove it, but I think there is there is a clear correlation. Yes, we've outsourced so many of our social relations to disembodied, abstract institutions. Correct.
And there is another dimension here. Well, actually, maybe it might be the same. It's interesting that there's the church and the mosques and the synagogues to a certain extent, and other faiths who call for the state to do more, rather than saying, actually, we have a responsibility towards the poor to help. We have the Church of England, which is quite wealthy, and I'm not having a go at it. You see the same thing in Islam, you see the same thing in Judaism, but it's quite often these religious leaders call for the state to do something, rather than say, we will take care of this. And of course, there's criticism both ways. Some people on the left say, the poor don't want your charity. The state should do this. Okay, look, we've got a few minutes left. We've got about 5 minutes. Time for a few more, one or two questions, please, here, and anyone else, and then we'll round up and let it go to the bar.
Hi, James Lawson from the Adam Smith Institute. May I offer an observation or a hypothesis rather than a question? Apologies in advance. So this is a new hypothesis that I've developed while listening to your provocative remarks. And we've approached the discussion so far as God a free marketeer from religion first and then thought about economic institutions, but we could do it the other way around. And in your very basic GCSE religious studies, one of the arguments against God is the problem of evil. But if we think about the prosperity we have today, maybe there is an alternative hypothesis, the blessing of prosperity. The default state of mankind before the modern world was one of extreme poverty felt by the vast majority of people. And perhaps with our God-given faculties and with modern civilization, with free trade and cooperation, with property rights and the rule of law, we had the Industrial Revolution and a huge amount of prosperity and wealth was generated, such that, yes, there is some evil in the world today, but actually there is a huge amount of prosperity, and that prosperity is being spread very widely. So perhaps that provides us an argument for why, actually, yes, God must be a free marketeer, because otherwise we wouldn't have such prosperity today. A second point on this concept as well is then if we look at around the world where there's been a clash between capitalism and socialism or communism, typically where that's been a very robust clash. So I take, for example, Latin America or older Europe. It was consistently the more capitalist side that seemed to be quite religious, and it was the communist side in particular that was very anti-religion, to the point of saying, religion is the opium of the masses. Mm-hmm. So that, to me, seems almost like a validation that not only are free markets something that God must believe in, but actually that those who are arguing for the most anti-free market ideas want to shun God altogether.
Okay, and last question, this gentleman here, please introduce yourself, and then we'll ask you to touch on, I may interject.
Andre from the Center for Enterprise Markets and Ethics.
Okay.
We do research at the intersection of theology and business, so I have too many questions to list here, but just kind of pulling the discussion back a little bit and looking at the main question, or at least the title's question, is God a free marketeer? I think what that really tries to ask is, what is kind of God's, or can we imagine what God's ideal socioeconomic kind of plan would be for creation? And I think here we do have to, this raises significant kind of ontological questions about who we are as humans. And I know Said, spoke about the dignity of humans. In terms, I come from a more Protestant background. We look at, humans as entrusted with gifts from God, and I can see in this sense, God in a sense calls humans to act directly in charity, as you say. Why do you think that, especially in the West, because I know there's a disconnect between the US and Europe on much of this and the role of the state, why do you think that at least Christians, that's the area I focus on, would see the legitimacy of the state as acting in their fulfilling their charitable needs, when quite clearly, being created in the image of God, Imago Dei, we're called to be actors ourselves directly, not through the state. So for either.
Thank you. So, either of you can answer either of the questions or respond to the points.
Sure. Yes. The prosperity gospel preacher at the back. No. I don't think so. A very good book is called Bad Religion by Ross Douthat, which talks a lot about the kind of the pernicious impact of the prosperity gospel in the 20th century US. Okay, I mean, God's blessings are not money. It's not like you pray more, you get more blessings, you get more income. That's not how it works. But I do think that it's important to take like really serious note of this like really unique bit of history that we live in. It's literally the last 200 years have been completely different to everything that happened before, and I think that it gives us there's a lot that we can do with that, and there's a lot on which that we could. Well, I think we'll be judged by what we do with it. We've received a lot, and it's very important that we do right with what we've been given. Do you want to answer that? Okay. I don't know. You mentioned about what's God's like favorite socioeconomic arrangement. I mean, I think God.
Are you?
I have not a very IEA response to this question, but I mean, God created His own favorite world, and we ruined it. So if we want to try to make it more how He wants it, then we should think about that and repent for the sin that we bring into His world, and put that first. I mean, put your own. You got to put your own conscience and your own soul first, and good socioeconomic institutions may emerge out of that.
But do you want to add anything just to round up?
No. Well, only that the very notions of perfectibility that I think both speakers, I think that's something you share. You said that we're getting things done better and or can do things better and better. That in itself is a religious notion. The ancient Greeks and Romans would be completely puzzled by a discussion that we think there is such a thing as progress. The Greeks and the Romans thought, if anything, things get worse.
Or
in cycles. The very notion that you're expressing shows just how deeply influenced we are by Abrahamic religions, because without them, and I don't know any of the others really, I can't speak, not every religion sees it that way, and it just shows that both of these questions, these viewpoints that have been expressed, demonstrate how profoundly, not how we are influenced, but how we are built on notions that are, when the deeper we look, actually all come out of religion.
Thank you. I think it's been a fascinating conversation, and one of the things I probably want to end in answering, or trying to attempt to answer the questions, is if you were not a classical liberal and you saw this question, you would be outraged. First of all, you probably want to cancel us. People want to cancel us anyway. But also, you would characterise people on our side of the spectrum as laissez-faire. Now, very few of us are completely laissez-faire. We believe some responsibility, and let's say an anarcho-capitalist. We believe in self-interest, but self-interest doesn't necessarily mean selfishness of the individual. Sometimes your self-interest is your self-interest of your community or your family or those you love. Now, some people might say that's communitarianism, that's interesting, but I think what we're saying here, I'm saying here, because there's no corporate view of the IEA, is that the debate really, I think, amongst the left and the right, and is I think everyone agrees that we should look after our fellow man or woman, fellow mankind. It's how we do it. Do we do it out of our own initiative, or do it via our communities, or via our church, or do we think the state should have that role? And people on our side of the spectrum would say, well, stop contracting out your compassion. Our political opponents or our ideological opponents would say, the state in some ways is a manifestation of what God would have wanted. To help fellow men. The debate will continue for centuries to come. I'm not going to predict when the Messiah will come, if you believe in that. But I just wanted to thank all of you for turning up this evening. Just to let you know that there is a bar for another 20 minutes, so please do continue the conversation, swap contact. I must do another plug for the book. special offer. As you can see on the back, it says £17.50. Special price tonight, £10. Don't wait for it to end up in a bargain bookshop or anything like that. Buy it now. We go towards a good cause. And can we also show our appreciation to both Benedikt and Billy in the usual way?
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.